Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this really special event on the Scottish Enlightenment, which is being held as part of the Melbourne Tartan Festival. I'm Georgina Downer, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute here at the University of Melbourne. It's wonderful to see lots of old friends here tonight, but it's, I have to admit, even more wonderful to see so many new friends. And I suspect the new friends come here with an interest in the Scottish Enlightenment due to some connection with Scotland. You might have some Scottish heritage of your own, or maybe you're just a devotee of those ideas, which is, admirable because they're so important to the shaping of our country. I myself have Scottish heritage. My paternal grandmother's family came out in the 19th century, like so many Scottish people did, to Australia from, and I can never pronounce it, Loch Winnock in Renfrewshire near Glasgow. It's was really a very, very important part of her heritage, and she duly was sent to a Scottish Presbyterian school in Adelaide, which my aunts went to and which I went to, and I even had the great pleasure of wearing a tam o' shanter when I was at the junior school, so we live and breathe it still to this day. I'd like to welcome some special guests tonight, particularly Carol Davis. I did see you before. Oh, there you are, Carol. Carol's the CEO of the Victorian Scottish Heritage Cultural Foundation. It rolls off the tongue, doesn't it, Carol? And she is the architect behind the Melbourne Tartan Festival, and it's been a great pleasure to work with her on these events over the last couple of years and be part of this great celebration of Scottish heritage, culture, and of course ideas, which is why we're here tonight. We also have with us two board members of the Robert Menzies Institute, of course, our guest speaker tonight, Dr. David Kemp, who certainly sings for his supper as a board member. We use him on a lot of our events, but you're a wealth of knowledge on these things. And I think Tim Lynch was joining us tonight too, although I haven't spied him. Finally, a big welcome to our Japarut Club members and our members who make our work possible, and your support really is so deeply appreciated. It, as I said, is the second year we've held this event, and I obviously accepted the opportunity with great pleasure because Robert Menzies, Australia's longest serving Prime Minister, who we celebrate here at the Robert Menzies Institute, was very proud of his own Scottish heritage, but also it gives me an opportunity to wear this dress again. It isn't the Bar Smith tartan, it's the Clan Campbell tartan, I understand, for those tartan experts. But it's very nice to get out in this. Robert Menzies was, as I said, incredibly proud of his Scottish heritage. His grandparents were Scottish crofters, and he was president, I think I've got this right, David, you're going to correct me, of the Melbourne Scots and the Royal Caledonian Society of Melbourne. We have here at the University Robert Menzies' personal library, the Menzies collection, and in it are a lot of works that relate to his Scottish heritage and clearly show signs that he really treasured that part of his identity. He has books on Clan Menzies or Mingus, and he has the complete works of Robert Burns. The Scottish Enlightenment and its ideas, though, were a great influence on Robert Menzies. You would know one of his great legacies was founding the Liberal Party of Australia in 1944. And in the lead up to that, he spoke about these ideas in his Forgotten People broadcast, which really articulated how he saw Australian liberalism developing. In these broadcasts, he talks about individual freedom, egalitarianism, a very deep commitment to education, critical thinking and reasoning. And he references as well in these broadcasts Scotland's national poet, Robert Burns, about, of course, more we'll hear of tonight from David Kemp. And Menzies speaks about how human nature being at its greatest when it combines dependence upon God with independence of man. And that was such an important sentiment that he took into his political philosophy. I'm really thrilled to introduce our two speakers to you tonight. They certainly don't need a huge amount of introduction, but they will bring to light two incredibly important figures from the Scottish Enlightenment. First of all, we'll hear from Dr. Chris Berg, who's sitting there very lonely. Sorry, Chris. Who will speak to us on Adam Smith. Chris is a former colleague of mine from the Institute of Public Affairs, but he went on to even bigger and better things, to become one of Australia's most significant voices for the ideas of Adam Smith, actually, free markets and individual liberty. He's become a global authority on regulation, technological change and civil liberties, and he's a professor of economics at RMIT University, where he co-founded their blockchain innovation hub. Our second speaker tonight is Dr. David Kemp, and he will be speaking on Scotland's national poet, Robert Burns. David is a former minister in the Howard government in the portfolios of education, employment and environment. Before entering politics, though, David was a professor of politics at Monash University. And since leaving politics, he has done great things like be on the board of the Robert Menzies Institute, but he's also written a magisterial 5-volume series on the history of Australian liberalism, and has been a great inspiration to our work here at the Robert Menzies Institute, exploring these political ideas. David is himself a proud Scots-Australian. I think he was president of the Melbourne Scots, and he was chair of the Scotch College Council for many years. Before I hand to Chris, I should just mention that we advertised a whiskey tasting, and you might have noticed you haven't had any whiskey yet. Don't fear, it's over there. And our resident Scotsman, Angus, who's at the back there, will be guiding you in the tasting after we hear from our speakers. So hold your horses. Without further ado, Chris Berg, welcome to the stage.
Thank you so much, Georgina. Thank you to the audience. It's a real pleasure to speak before David. David is interesting for two reasons. I mean, probably many more than two reasons, but I'm going to give two. First of all, he is someone who studied politics to a very deep level and then thought, oh, you know what I really want to do? I want to do that, which is remarkable. Heroic. And secondly, he is the author of the most important history of liberalism, the history of liberalism that I'm going to draw on today in some of my comments. And David made incredible contributions to the Australian government and to the Australian people, but he also set liberalism down for generations to come of Australians. And so we can understand much more about the Australia that we are because of the work that David's done. And huge admirer of that work, and extremely commended to him, to you all. The reason I raise that is because I've been always very interested in the vision that Australians have had of themselves. And you dig through, before David's incredible work, you dig through the texts about Australian history. And you get different stories, particularly from liberals as well, about what were we in the 19th century? What culture, what political moment did we come out of? And in the 1930s, a lot of sort of pessimism, and the liberals at that time would describe the early Australia as a prison colony. You know, quite accurately, but they describe it as a prison colony, and that prison colony ethos and culture extended through the 20th century, and that's how they saw it. Others later in the 20th century saw it as a contest between the conservatives on one hand, who wanted to bring back the principles of the United Kingdom, and the Democrats, who were more radical, and they wanted a more radical open society. More recently, particularly through the 1960s and 1970s, people like Greg Maloosh have argued that we were an offshoot of the Enlightenment, a very compelling argument that we came from this European Enlightenment, partly Scottish Enlightenment, but Enlightenment more broadly. The one I've always been most interested in, though, is called the fragment thesis. So the fragment thesis was, it came from a scholar named Louis Hartz, and Louis Hartz was looking at the colonial settler societies, and he was saying that colonial settler societies were defined by the era in which they were settled. They were a fragment of the society where they came from. So, for example, the United States was a fragment of Britain at the time that it was established. So it had these visions of human rights. It was Lockean. It had these great ideas, revolutionary ideas. And he also said, British Canada was the same. Prior to that, South American countries, the French Canadians, they were more feudal. Their fragment was from a previous generation. In 1985, a fellow named Hugh Collins applied the fragment thesis to Australia. And he said, well, where did we come from? And he argued that we're a Benthamite society. So we were founded in an era, a post-radical Lockean era about human rights, an era where utilitarianism ran the day. Jeremy Bentham was a famous utilitarian philosopher. Greatest happiness for the greatest number was his principle. He was legalistic because he was a lawyer, and he focused on the rules. He focused on rationalism, individualism. So he wasn't a communist or anything like that, but he wasn't a socialist. He was an individualist, but he was a rule order type guy. And his idea was that, well, Australia, we're not revolutionaries as a result. We don't have this woolly attachment to human rights. We're individualists, but we're kind of practical. I'm sure you probably all in this room have that vision of Australia. I think it's a very influential vision. And for a very long time, I was convinced by that. It makes sense. We're not comfortable talking about notions of human rights. We're individualistic, but in a sort of practical way. We're not like the Americans. The Americans are crazy. We're not like them. It's a good thesis. I had a question, though, and the problem that I've always had with this thesis is, okay, that's great. Did we read Jeremy Bentham? Was Jeremy Bentham available? Were these ideas in Australia? So anyway, I'm going to talk you through a research project that I did, and then I'm going to talk you through the implications of that research project. So turns out that Australia is an incredibly small country in the 19th century. It's still pretty small, as we know, but it's incredibly small in the 19th century. And one of the advantages with a tiny country in that era is that we can know almost everything about at least a few things. And one of the things that we can know almost everything about is the books that were available to the Australian colonists. Because the way that books were sold in the 19th century in Australia was at auctions that were advertised in newspapers. And booksellers would sell their books and list the books that were for sale in the newspapers. Pretty cool. In fact, there's a scholar in the 1970s, 1980s, who actually gave us a list of every single book auction in Australia, every book that was sold, or at least to our knowledge, that was sold. And the way the book industry worked at the time is that there were some bookstores, so you could go to a small number of bookstores that had regular inventory, but most of the time, books were just sent from the UK to Australia on what they called consignment. So the Brits would decide, British book printers, publishers would decide, we're going to send all these books to Australia and hopefully they sell. In fact, some scholars have described it as a dumping ground for the refuse of British. Still is. Anyway, so I thought, okay, cool. We've got this list. In fact, now, thanks to the National Library of Australia, all those newspapers are on the internet. I can just look at them. This was the most boring research project I've ever done. I counted every single book available to the Australians, looking for the ones about political economy, because I wanted to know, well, what were these people reading? I'll make a point. They may not have wanted these books, but they're the ones they were given. They were the ones the Brits sent down. They may not have wanted to read Bentham or anybody else, but if they were sent down, well, they're the books available, so they're probably the ones that are going to be read. I'll fast forward to the conclusion. By far, by a significant margin, the most read book in Australia in political economy was Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. So Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, I could find 132 separate copies of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations sold, or at least available for sale, in Australia between the years of 1800 and 1849. It was by far the most popular book. Now, Bentham, where was Bentham? Bentham was almost nowhere. So Bentham was very rarely available. It's not even available until 1833, I believe. Jeremy Bentham was publishing from about 1780 onward. He died in 1832 from memory. But Jeremy Bentham's books just weren't available in Australia. There were one or two people who were really interested in Jeremy Bentham, but for the most part, the book that everybody had available to them, and I'm presuming at least opened up and read the first chapter, which is the only chapter you need to read, was Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And this makes sense. I mean, we see traces of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations throughout Australian public history. So you flick through these newspapers and you can see these mentions of the Brits that they are following, the continental authors that they're following. And really, the big names that you see are Frederick Bastiat, the French economist, later in the century, but Adam Smith. To the extent that I was looking at a piece today, actually, published in around 1830, and it was using an Adam Smith quote to demonstrate that, you know what you really want to do? You want to buy land in Australia. Imagine if you'd been able to buy land in London 2 centuries ago. Well, that's like buying land in Sydney. You know, he's not wrong. But they were using Adam Smith as the core vision of themselves. I'll make a couple of points about that. What else did we see in these books? So first of all, what we didn't see was much Benthamite utilitarian. In fact, we saw quite the opposite. So I've got Blackstone's Commentary on the Laws of England, which is a sort of natural rights vision or an ancient rights vision of what the United Kingdom was that Jeremy Bentham hated, I'll point it out. There was John Locke. John Locke was incredibly popular. I've got, how many copies I've got? I've got 32 copies of John Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding. I do have one really interesting utilitarian book, which is by a fellow named William Paley. You probably haven't heard of William Paley. He was a utilitarian. He's actually the second most popular book, but he's a religious utilitarian. And so he hasn't got this legalistic perspective. He's got the idea that, well, God wants us to care about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So it's a utilitarianism that is driven by not that sort of sharp utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham. Malthus is there. There's lots of books available to the Australian colonies. Now, there's a couple of interesting things about that before I jump onto Adam Smith. First of all, it's important to remember that in the first couple of decades of Australian history, we were not very far away from England. So the people who lived in Australia viewed themselves as part, obviously, of English civilization, but they typically were born in the mother country. They had parents from the mother country. They were educated often from the mother country, or their parents were educated from that. They were very close and they felt very close. So it is less than a generation from Warwickshire to Sydney. And that's how they saw themselves. They did not see themselves as starting anew. They did not come up with ideas the moment they landed in Sydney or Perth or Adelaide or Melbourne. They felt themselves part of British civilization. So, Adam Smith. As I try to figure out there we are. I printed double-sided. That is a huge mistake if you're giving a presentation. All right, so who is Adam Smith? I'm sure that you've got some idea of Adam Smith. Adam Smith He was born in Scotland in 1723, came from a modest family, educated at Glasgow and Oxford. He studied moral philosophy. He was appointed a professor of logic at Glasgow in 1751. His first major work is The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The Theory of Moral Sentiments is a fantastic book, but not as well read as it is as The Wealth of Nations, the one you've probably heard of. The people who sold me this tie. This is an Adam Smith tie. I'm not wearing tartan, I apologise. I don't have any Scottish background, so I thought Adam Smith tie, when else am I going to wear it? And I'm an academic, we don't wear ties. This is a special one because it's yellow. That's kind of rare. But the people who sold me this tie are not thinking of the Theory of Moral Sentiments as much. They're thinking about The Wealth of Nations. And you're probably familiar with The Wealth of Nations. He wrote it a couple of decades after. The Wealth of Nations is described as often as this lodestar of free market economics. It is more sophisticated than perhaps most people have, or some of the people who wear the tie suggest. But the key thing about Adam Smith is that The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is a book about moral philosophy and what we owe each other, about the role that we play in developing our own human relations, the way we relate to each other in a social situation, in a familial situation, in a civilizational situation, and The Wealth of Nations, this book that is about free market economics. What should the government do? What is the most efficient market arrangement? These books go together. These books are consistent with each other. Because Adam Smith was the first great economist because of The Wealth of Nations, but he was the first great liberal philosopher because what he had was a vision of commercial society and what that meant to us. How do you have a commercial society where people live lives of value, live lives in community, while simultaneously getting the benefits from market exchange that will make them wealthy? So as Adam Smith would argue, commercial society gives us everything that we want in the sense of prosperity. It gives us opulence. It lifts up the living standards for people who are worse off. In fact, Adam Smith was very concerned about the people who are worse off as well. He said, "No society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of its members are poor and miserable." And his answer to that was, obviously we need sympathy, but also we need markets and we need economic growth and we need prosperity. He believed in free trade and competition, which I know is very radical these days. He believed in the virtuous power of self-interest. He did not believe that self-interest was something that should be shunned. He believed that self-interest actually drove the economy forward. It needed to be moderated by principles of justice, but self-interest was a necessary part of the economy. But at the same time, he believed very, very strongly in a moral sense and sympathy. One of my little interests about Adam Smith is Adam Smith's cultural role in British society. And I don't know whether you know this, but a great deal of books like Pride and Prejudice are driven by some of the ideas that Adam Smith was pushing forward arguing for in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. So in Pride and Prejudice specifically, Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, they learn to love each other and discover each other going through what some scholars have argued is a interactive moral education, which is exactly how Adam Smith believes, that we go through as part of our social training. We go through a moral education to become sympathetic with each other. And through that sympathy, we form societies and we form communities as well. So Adam Smith believed in ideas about moderate virtue, moral education, prudence, in an environment that was commercial. In an environment where you had open markets, you had open trade, you had the expansion of market organizations. He believed in the reduction of dependence on others. He believed very much in what we would now describe as democratic virtues of independence, but at the same time, he believed it in a morally sympathetic environment as well, as I try to flick through. What else do I have to say? Let's see. All right, fantastic. He believed in those important things that we all believe in, of course: order and good government, liberty matched to security, the rule of law, what he described as, his ideal state was peace, easy taxes and a tolerable administration of justice. These were the visions that I believe that the Australian colonists got from Adam Smith. I'm going to finish up with a final point. Georgina pointed out that actually my day job is focusing on technology. So this is fun for me. I'm a historian, but most of my work is focused on the new technologies that are pushing society forward: AI, blockchain, quantum computing. I could go through the list. What I think is interesting about Adam Smith and when he's writing is that Adam Smith is writing at the start of his own industrial revolution. So there's a very famous story that we use for pedagogy when we teach students about how markets work, particularly the division of labour, which is the pin factory. So the pin factory describes the division of labour. We split out the process of making the pin. One person taps it, one person stretches it, and there's something like 15 or so steps in that. It's a really interesting example for someone who was writing in 1776, because he's writing about how factories are organised. In 1776, factories are rare. Factories are not a common or major part of the economy. The reason he chose that example was actually because of Diderot's encyclopedia. He got the example from Diderot, who had looked at these factory organisations as that's a really novel thing. And Adam Smith looks at this remarkable description of what a factory is by Diderot, and he says, well, that actually illustrates beautifully. This frontier technology, this frontier industrial organisation illustrates perfectly for me these basic principles of what we now call liberal economics. Now, I think we're going through a stage like that again. I think we're going through another industrial revolution. I think we're going through the digital revolution, and a lot of what we work on, my colleagues and I, is trying to understand what these wild, insane, rapid digital changes are doing, how they help us understand economics and the principles of economics, but what they're doing to society. What are the moral virtues that we need to encourage? What does society look like in an increasingly digital global world? I'm sure we've all got many views about that. But I just want to leave you with that single point, that what Adam Smith was looking at when he was publishing in 1776, in the 18th century, was the absolute frontier of his world. And he brought that frontier, or the Australians brought that frontier, maybe not even the Australians, maybe the British book publishers who were dumping books in Australia. They brought that frontier to Australia, and we understood that, and we focused on it, and we learned from it, and that set the liberal vision that I think we've all benefited from. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. That was a wonderful whip around Adam Smith and his influence on Australia. I was just referring to my notes that our historian Zach Gorman prepared for me, and I was interested to read that in 1855, just after the University of Melbourne was established, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was the core part of the syllabus of the political economy subject here, and actually the University of Melbourne became a bastion of classical liberalism through those decades. I suspect it is no longer the case. But, this is a seminal period, of course, 19th century, mid-19th century, when Australians are developing the ideas that really establish our federation, and we are the inheritors of that legacy to this day. Now for Dr. David Kemp and Robert Burns. Thank you. just
We're just going to get a moment of instruction on the slides.
just that button.
That one in the middle.
Yeah.
Okay.
The arrow to the right is to proceed.
Is that what's on the screen?
That is what's on the screen.
What about that?
Yeah, that's on the screen. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
This is the height of technology here.
Well, first of all, Chris, thank you very much for your very kind remarks at the start of your address. My address tonight is going to be a different character to that of Chris, because I'm going to tell you a story about one person and how he fits into the Enlightenment. A lot of people probably don't think that Robert Burns is an Enlightenment figure because they think of him as a romantic poet. He's concerned with beautiful women and love, and a different kind of world is his world compared to the world of Adam Smith. Tonight I'm going to put the historical facts to you that that is not the case. That in fact Robert Burns is very much a man, despite the fact that he's a poet, and perhaps because of that, embedded in the Enlightenment. And we will find that Burns's romanticism is broad enough to extend to political romanticism. And I'm going to be putting the view to you tonight that he was a political romantic. And we can see that in lots of the things that he did and happened. And I suppose because my background is politics, I'm going to be emphasising Burns's politics, which is what is not emphasised very often when we think of Robert Burns. But he was in fact quite a political activist in his own way, and I'd like to tell you a bit about that tonight. There's a story in our family that Robert Burns actually wrote a poem about my four-greats-grandmother. Her name, unmarried name, pre-marriage, was Mary Lumsden. She was the wife of David Wilson. My mother was a Wilson, so there was a direct line of descent back there. They lived in Fife. And there's a poem in the complete works of Robert Burns, in some editions I've discovered, which is called To Mrs. David Wilson. Now, quite what my four-greats-grandfather, Mr. David Wilson, thought when he saw this poem is not recorded. One can imagine that, I think. However, on reading the poem, which I have done, he would have been reassured, because it's a tribute to his wife's cooking. And the poem says that whenever Burns arrived at his door, he never went past it. He came in and had a good meal. So I don't want to imply that this is necessarily true. Certainly there were members of our family when I was doing my family history who believed it was true. But having done a little bit of research on this, it seems to me that there are historians who locate this Mrs. David Wilson somewhere other than where my Mrs. David Wilson lived, in Fife. So that hasn't affected our family tradition in the matter, however, and we stand by the story. Robert Burns was born on January the 25th, of course, 1759. All Scots will know that, even though the Melbourne Scots, of which I'm chieftain at the moment, at the appointment of the Melbourne Scots Council, holds its Burns Night a month later, essentially, than that, because Australians are all on the beach in January. But he was born in South Ayrshire, which was the son of a tenant farmer. And this is where he was born, and you can visit that in Scotland if you go there. As a boy, he worked a plough, a fact that was remembered throughout his life, and people always referred to him as the ploughman poet. And it certainly then, and I'm sure even now, helps to foster the glamorous reputation that Robert Burns has. An important fact, however, of this Scotland at this time was that the Presbyterian Church insisted that every child attend school. And despite the family's poverty, and with the encouragement of his self-taught father, he became not only literate, but in fact Burns became learned. His father, William Burns, whom Robert later described, and I love this description, as a gentleman who derived his patent of nobility direct from Almighty God. And William Burns ensured that the boy was well read. In fact, one of his biographers, Sir Richard Fowler, makes it clear that at an early age, at his father's learning, Burns studied John Locke's essay on understanding, human understanding, and perhaps Locke's other writings on social contract between government and its citizens. And Locke himself was one of the great sources of the American Revolution, which we'll get to in Burns's career. By the age of 13, Burns knew Latin and French. He read widely. He wrote poetry as a teenager and became acquainted, Chris will be interested to hear, with Adam Smith's widely read work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which influenced Burns and indeed influenced some of his poetry. And he later read Smith's Wealth of Nations. And in fact, in 1787, which was well into Burns's career, he tried to meet with Adam Smith. And Adam Smith was a great admirer of Burns's work, and he wanted to meet Burns, but unfortunately his health permitted it. So Adam Smith and Robert Burns never actually met. A meeting they'd arranged was cancelled because of Smith's poor health. Now let me just again reiterate something that Georgina and Chris have said about the Scottish Enlightenment. It was a time, and this is looking at it a bit through Burns's eyes, it was a time when the cruel enforcement of religious dogma was challenged and people had been executed in Scotland for their religious beliefs. When science pushed its way to replace the idea of magic ruling the world, the benefits of personal freedom came to be recognised, when government's objective began to change from securing the rights of the powerful to achieving the public interest, and when the idea of the equal human dignity of all people replaced the idea of justifiable slavery and class and racial privilege. The campaign for equal laws, as Burns matured, gained a great deal of force, and an activist organisation to support it called the Friends of the People. And we'll hear a little bit more about that. So the liberal democracy that we claim today was actually being born at this very time. And Burns was to be one of the great communicators of that view. The ideas and attitudes of the Enlightenment came to Australia, of course, first on Captain Cook's Endeavour and later en masse in the First Fleet, embedded in the minds of Arthur Phillip and many of the people who came with him, his officers. Tonight I want to draw particular attention to this man, Lachlan Macquarie, one of Australia's greatest governors. On his tombstone, which you can see at the top there in the graveyard at Mull, the words Father of Australia are inscribed. Now, the thing about Macquarie, which is relevant tonight, is that Macquarie was close friends with two men, John and James Dunlop. And the interesting thing is that Burns's great patron was a woman, Frances Anne Wallace Dunlop. And she supported him in his work as a poet. And those two men that Burns was friendly with, John Dunlop and James Dunlop, were her sons and had served in the military. So it immediately makes somebody with an interest in history wonder whether the ideas of Macquarie and the ideas of Burns were closely related. And so the question is, were Robert Burns's poems available in the books available to the colonists. And the first Burns Supper was held in Australia when Macquarie was governor in 1818. So Burns has an influence in Australia which is perhaps not widely understood. Now, today, I think those who know Burns are thrilled by the quality of his poetry and think of the ploughman poet with great affection. And it is true that Burns had researched in Enlightenment fashion the songs that were being taught in and remembered in Scottish villages. And he collected these together and signed off on probably improved versions of these in his great book, Poems Chiefly in the Scottish Dialect. He assigned the rights and profits of this book, and that's a copy of the first edition, so they could be used to support the child of one Jean Armour. Jean had been described by Robert as his delicious armful, and he went through a written mutual declaration of marriage with her, a declaration that was actually legal under Scottish law at the time. And this was against the wishes, unfortunately, of her father, but the relationship between them remained over the years, and in fact, they are both buried in the same tomb on Mull. James Buchan, the grandson of the famous thriller writer John Buchan, described Edinburgh's reaction when the young Robert Burns returned from his trip and published his book. And quoting Buchan, he says, Edinburgh believed in genius. Pure genius had the power to demolish or suspend social form. And Edinburgh instantly decided that Burns was such a pure genius. With his dark, flashing eyes, his height, his charm, his poetry, he wowed Edinburgh. And his reputation in 1787 was born. Mrs. Frances Dunlop, a descendant, of course, of William Wallace's brother, as it happens, asked for his poems. He was feted by the high and mighty. At 27 years old, Burns was rather thrilled at his own reaction to the great reception he'd received, and he wrote to a friend in December of that year, "You may bear me witness, when my bubble of fame was at its highest, I stood unintoxicated with the inebriating cup in my hand." In many ways, Burns's ideas were not realistic, but they can be summed up probably in what Australian politicians might call 2 R's. One is romantic. In politics and in life, he was a romantic. And that's the word that springs to mind, as I said, when anyone thinks of Robert Burns. The other R word is radical. And as Hamlet said, there's the rub. When applied to politics, the word romantic can be misleading. It has nothing to do with what we normally think of as romantic love, and a great deal to do with idealism. Lost causes are commonplace among political romantics. But if you're a political romantic, you're aiming high, and sometimes great things can be achieved. Among Burns's romantic ideals was Scotland itself, rebuilt and restored after the disaster of the Stuart Uprising and the bloodbath of the Battle of Culloden, followed by massacres as it had been in Scottish towns and villages, and harsh restrictions on Scottish culture, including, for a period, the banning of the wearing of the kilt. And this brings me to the word radical. Born some 13 years after Culloden, Burns wanted big changes. Romantic, he might be, but he was a true child of the Enlightenment. He had no difficulty, like Adam Smith, in picturing a kinder, more moral, more equal and sympathetic world. Burns was greatly dissatisfied with many of the features of his time, and he started with the regime in London. He was a sympathiser with those who wanted to reverse the result of Culloden. They were called the Jacobites, those who'd supported the exiled King James, and in Latin, James is translated as Jacobus, which is why the Jacobites were called the Jacobites. This was one of the lost causes. Supporting the Jacobites was not wise, with the Hanoverians in full control. In 1787, Burns embarked on a tour of Scotland, and he was impolitic enough to scratch a poem on the window of an inn where he was staying. It was a treasonous poem, a Jacobite poem against the Hanoverian Georges. And with his usual passion, he wrote the lines, "The injured Stuart line are gone, a race outlandish fill their throne, an idiot race, to honour lost who know them best despise them most." Now, to write this on an inn window was the 18th century equivalent of sending an email to the world. The email, as they say, is deadlier than the mail. Widely circulated emails can cause a lot of difficulties. Every traveller who came to the room could read the message, and that would get him into trouble. As our hero reflected on this fact, he became more and more disturbed by what he'd written. And still using the language of emails, he decided to recall it. A couple of months later, he went back to the inn and smashed the window. But it was too late. Many travellers had noted the verses. He was less cautious on another occasion, when he attended an occasion where whiskey flowed, nothing like tonight's occasion, I can assure you, and the toast was proposed by the chairman to the British Prime Minister William Pitt. Burns leapt to his feet and sought to amend the motion to a toast reading "To the health of a better and greater man, George Washington." Because, of course, when Burns was 17, Thomas Jefferson had penned the immortal words of the Declaration of Independence, declaring that all men were created equal and endowed with inalienable rights, amongst which were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And further, that to secure these rights, government were instituted amongst men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. These were sentiments that Burns thought in the very fibre of his being were true. His great hero, in fact, was Tom Paine, the man whose book Common Sense was widely credited with having stirred the passions that led to the American War of Independence. Like Jefferson, the young poet was hopeful that the French Revolution might have a good outcome. This was the romantic and the radical in him combined. In his letters to Frances Dunlop, Burns expressed pro-revolutionary views, telling her with satisfaction that groans and hisses had drowned out "God Save the King" in the Dumfries Theatre, and more dangerously, failing to express sympathy for the French King and Queen at their execution. Apparently for Frances Dunlop, this was just too much. She broke off relations and kept the confidences, however, that Robert had given her. But these were tough political times. The English were not about to take any nonsense from any of the Scots. And Burns was appalled to discover in 1793 that he was being investigated for his political views. And that, of course, threatened his livelihood, he was an excise agent, effectively working on behalf of the government. He was a public servant. When Burns heard of the investigation, he quickly passed his copies of Common Sense and The Rights of Man, Payne's two books, to a close friend, George Hall, for safekeeping. He wrote letters to the authorities asserting his innocence. He got off with a warning this time and a reprimand from the authorities, but others were not so lucky. That year, the barrister Thomas Muir, vice president of one of the Societies of the People, was tried on sedition in Edinburgh and sentenced to 14 years transportation to New South Wales, along with 4 other so-called Scottish martyrs. It seems likely, historians think, that Burns was moved by the injustice of these sentences to write the song Scots wha hae where Wallace bled, the final words of which: tyrants fall in every foe, liberties in every blow, let us do or die. Despite the trial, he continued to delight in the company of those with radical opinions, and he inscribed on a book in the Dumfries Library these words: Mr. Burns presents the book to the library and begs they will take it as a creed of British liberty until they find a better. This was another email. Reflecting on it overnight, he returned to the library and tore out the page in the book. Burns, after all, was a poet. We mustn't be critical of him or say that he lacked courage. If he was stopped from writing, his life had no meaning to him. His powerful weapon was his poetry. And the great democratic idea appealed to him more than any other. And it was in one of his poems that he inscribed the imperishable words which are on the screen: for are that and are that, it's coming yet for are that man to man the world o'er shall brothers be, for are that. Nor was Burns's democratic spirit reserved for men. In 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft had published A Vindication of the Rights of Women, while poems such as I Fond Kiss, My Love is Like a Red Rose expressed Burns's love for women, he also put into verse his respect for them. While quacks of state much ceased to produce his plan, and even children lisped the rights of man, amid this mighty fuss, just let me mention the rights of woman merit some attention. Burns died on July the 21st, 1796, at the age of 37. His health hadn't been good for some time, and while the exact cause of his death hasn't been definitively discovered, it's widely believed that he suffered from rheumatic fever, which may have led to the complications relating to heart disease. But by then, his reputation was secure, and he's buried in Dumfries. Which brings me back to the father of Australia. And I'll finish on just trying to tie up that Australian connection. With Lachlan Macquarie, it's not at all hard to see him very much under the sway of Burns's, as a Scot, very much under the sway of Burns's democratic spirit. He was a Freemason like Burns. And it was Macquarie who made the first great democratic statement in Australian history. He said it should be a basic principle that once a convict has become a free man, he should in all respects be considered on a footing with every other man in the colony, according to his rank and character. What could be more Scottish or more enlightened than that? I doubt if there's any poet in the world more honoured than Robert Burns in statue and stone. When you go to Canberra and see the statue of Burns on National Circuit, or pause to admire the handsome monument in Spring Street, which is on the left of the screen, not far from our State Parliament House, or comparable memorials in Sydney and Melbourne, the other statue is in Ballarat, reflect on how appropriate it is that in this great democracy, right next to our parliaments, we should honour the ploughman poet who believed in his fellow man. Let me finish with these words, that our political life is at its best when we're working to put into practice that belief that Burns cherished in the dignity of every person. The young genius of Scotland made this his anthem 200 years ago, and we could do worse than to make it ours. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for that beautiful expose on Robert Burns and his romanticism as a political figure as well. Before I pass to Angus, I would like to formally thank both Chris and David with a small token of our appreciation, some Menzies Yalumba wine. And actually, before I go to Angus, I do have a few things I wanted to spruik to you. You would have seen on your seat a flyer for our annual dinner and our oration that will be held on Wednesday, the 24th of September. At the wonderful Ormond College, actually, just on College Crescent here, which is Robert Menzies' alma mater. I know as enthusiasts for the Scottish Enlightenment, you will have free speech dear to your hearts, and you will see from the flyer that we are extremely lucky to have Lord Young of Acton, Toby Young, who is the founder of the Free Speech Union and a great advocate for free speech, delivering our oration this year. He has been a fierce advocate for free speech in Britain and has defended people through the Free Speech Union who he disagrees with, who he agrees with great effect, and is a really, really powerful voice for those sentiments and values in Britain, but also spreading it throughout the world. There's a Free Speech Union here in Australia and one in New Zealand and one in the United States. It's a great movement, and I really encourage you all to attend. We also have our annual conference this year, which will be held in this room, and given your interest in the Scottish Enlightenment, I think you'd find the topic of this year's conference, Menzies in the British Commonwealth of Nations, particularly appealing. Now, for those of you who are members, you'll know that you can come to our conference for free and get a discounted ticket to our annual dinner and oration. If you're not a member, you'd be mad not to be a member, because you can actually join as a general member for less than it costs to attend our conference. So, you know, you do the maths, you do the Adam Smith. Finally, you get to come to all our events other than our annual dinner and oration for free. So it's a great deal. You get to come to events like this tonight. We have regular events, and we really value the support of our members. You're a wonderful community. You support our work. You make our events richer through your conversation and fellowship. So a thank you to those who are already members and an encouragement to those who will become members. Finally, to Angus Gillies, resident Scotsman and our digital and events coordinator here at the Menzies Institute, to the whisky tasting. And I know time is massively afoot, it's already 7, so appreciate those of you who might have to pop off, but if you'd like to stay for this, Angus has a few words to say and then you can get on and try the beautiful whisky. Thanks, Angus.
Hi everyone. I'm Angus. I am the Digital Communications and Events Officer here. It's great to be here. Thanks for everyone. I'm also Scottish, so I know. Thank you. It's very hard work. I'm not an academic or an expert, but I am Scottish, so in some ways I am. Yes, exactly. I'm just here to give a very quick explainer on the whiskey you'll find over there. I encourage everyone to go try it. Quick show of hands, who here would order whiskey? It's better than I thought. I'm still in trouble. Well, 2 quick points. I'll just go over what the whiskey is, which has been very generously donated by Bladnoch Whiskey, which I think has supported us now for the last 2 years. So thank you very much to Bladnoch. And so firstly, I'll just talk about what we're drinking, and then secondly, much more importantly, how you sound smart when you talk about whiskey. So the whiskey, Bladnoch, is a lowland whiskey, just like Menzies' grandfather, I think, who's also from Renfrewshire. The distillery's been around since 1812, so there's a chance that Menzies' paternal grandfather and the whiskey could have crossed paths. It's matured in sherry and bourbon casks, rich and smooth, but enough of that. How we sound smart when someone else orders a whiskey for you. There's 3 steps. The first is the nose, how it smells. I've met someone whose nose was insured for £1.5 million. He's called The Nose. He's a very famous master distiller. He also smokes very heavy Cuban cigars. But what do I know? My nose isn't insured for £1.5 million. The trick for this part, in my own experience, is whatever you smell, whether it's caramel, citrus, old leather, it's 100% true, even if you're making it up. The second thing is the taste, it's the mouthfeel, it's the texture. It's a very good chance to use some poetic words. If the bottle says over there that you'll get green apples, chocolate, and a hint of pepper, maybe you will, maybe you won't. The trick is to commit to it. And finally, the finish. So that's what lingers. I once asked the chairman of Celtic, who was director of the Whiskey magazine I used to edit, what makes a whiskey? What's it all about? And he said, it's all about the finish. The rest is just marketing. So it's the last impression. The longer and richer the finish, the more memorable the whiskey. So that's it. Nose, mouthfeel, finish, you're now whiskey connoisseurs. And the last story just before I go is I once asked that same chairman if he was a football man, because he was chairman of Celtic. And he said, honestly, I'm a whiskey man first, football comes second. And he probably thought I'd keep that quiet. Little did he know, I'm a Rangers fan. 2-0, Slancha fan.